I mentioned universal grammar briefly in the last video on innateness. I'd like to discuss universal grammar in a little more detail now. So, coming back to this notion, if children do not learn languages through imitation, but through the testing and application of various generalizations, and if much of their faculty for language is innate, that is to say, if they're born with this faculty for learning languages, that their brains are structured to learn languages, then there would be some degree of uniformity to all these languages. The things that the language faculty is capable of doing would shape and constrain what languages can be. And these would have to be common. A German baby adopted by French parents has to have a language faculty that would allow it to learn French. It would be fairly comic if this were not true, but it is. Radford explains, "It therefore follows that the language faculty must incorporate a set of principles of universal grammar in the sense that the language faculty must be such as to allow the child to develop a grammar of any natural language on the basis of suitable linguistic experience of the language." So, in other words, whatever the language faculty is, it must be structured in such a way that any child could learn any language when they're exposed to it. Any child could learn any natural language when they're exposed to it. So one of the tasks of a linguist studying syntax is to find out what this set of principles of universal grammar are. What are these things that all languages have in common? But languages are not all the same. There are differences. So how do we make sense of these differences while seeking out these commonalities? One attempt to make sense of the differences while still acknowledging and looking for the commonalities is referred to as the principles and parameters theory. The language faculty would determine the set of principles that every language must follow. The language faculty would limit and determine what every language had to have. Within these restrictions, these principles that every language had to have would be some choices, and these choices are the parameters. The idea is that for language to be innate, there must be a biologically endowed set of capacities that would shape and restrain the language, the principles, but for the languages of the world to be different, there must be a number of areas of flexibility and difference within this faculty as well, and these are the parameters. In the next presentation in the series, we're going to learn about the principles and parameters theory. To go on a bit of a tangent though, how does this apply to second language acquisition? Do second language learners have access to the universal grammar in the same way that first language learners do? There are three possible positions we can take on this that spring to mind immediately. 1. They have direct access to the universal grammar. Learners learn the L2 the same way they do the L1. 2. They have no access to the universal grammar. Learners acquire the language through other mental faculties. The L2 is learnt the same way that other areas of knowledge are learnt. Or 3, they have indirect access to the universal grammar. Learners can learn the L2 through the universal grammar, but they start with a universal grammar that's already preset and have to unlearn some of the settings. So spend some time thinking about what these three different possibilities imply. What do you think? Do you think they have direct access to the universal grammar? They have no access to the universal grammar? Or they have indirect access to the universal grammar? People have problems learning second languages. People are less successful and sometimes fail at learning a second language. If universal grammar is accessible, why are some languages harder to learn as a second language? If universal grammar is still accessible, why is it harder to learn a language when you're an adult?